After I helped an old man cross the street, he whispered, "When your husband gives you earrings, don't put them on." Hi, welcome to my channel. I've got a new story for you today.
I helped an old man cross the street, and after we reached the other side, he stopped, looked straight into my eyes, and said, "When your husband gives you earrings, don't put them on. Soak them in warm water overnight." I almost forgot the whole thing. But when my husband came home with a pair of shimmering gold earrings, I followed the old man's advice. What I found was something truly horrifying. Hello everyone, welcome to our story. Before we begin, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Quick note, this is a fictional story created for entertainment and meaningful reflection. Any resemblance to real names or places is purely coincidental, but the message it carries absolutely worth your time. The tile was cold against my bare feet. Not the gentle cool of an early morning floor, but the kind of cold that climbs starting at your soles, moving up through your ankles, settling somewhere deep in your chest where it has no business being. I had been standing in that bathroom long enough for the cold to travel that far. I hadn't moved. I wasn't sure I could. It was 6:15 on a Saturday morning in September. Nashville was just beginning to stir outside my window. I could hear the low rumble of a garbage truck somewhere on the next block, the distant bark of someone's dog answering it. Normal sounds, ordinary sounds, the kind of sounds that belong to a world where everything is fine. Nothing in my bathroom felt fine. My hands were pressed flat against the edge of the cabinet, fingers curled hard around the shelf like it was the only thing keeping me upright. Maybe it was, because they're pushed to the back of the top shelf behind the orange bottle of cold medicine and a spare toothbrush I'd been meaning to throw out for months was a glass of water. Except the water wasn't clear. It was thick and yellowish and deeply wrongly clouded the color of something that had no business coming from a kitchen tap. Water does not turn that color on its own overnight. I knew that. Standing there in my old University of Tennessee sweatshirt hair, still pulled back in the same loose knot I'd slept in, I knew that with a certainty that sat in my stomach like a stone. At the bottom of the glass, barely visible through the murk, were two small shapes. Gold. Delicate. The earrings Curtis had pressed into my palm less than 12 hours ago. I made myself look away. I looked at the mirror instead, and the woman looking back at me was someone I almost didn't recognize. Not because she looked different exactly. Same dark circles, same tired set to her jaw, same sweatshirt she'd owned since her junior year of college. But her eyes looked like someone who had just understood something and was still deciding what to do with the understanding. I'd been so careful, and yet here I was. I thought about Curtis's face the night before. The way he'd been standing in the hallway when I got home, freshly shaved, wearing a button-down shirt that still had the sharp fold lines from the store packaging pressed into the sleeves. He'd been holding a small blue velvet box, turning it over slowly in his hands, the way you turn something over when you've been waiting a long time to give it away. He smiled when he saw me. Wide and warm and practiced, and his eyes, I kept coming back to his eyes. They weren't on my face. They weren't on the box. They drifted almost immediately, just slightly to the side, to my ears. He stood there watching my ears the way you watch a door you're waiting for someone to walk through. I had smiled back. I had said thank you. I had told him the earrings were beautiful and that I'd wear them to the office on Monday because I was in my sweats and they deserved better. He had nodded, and for just a fraction of a second, so fast I almost missed it. Something shifted behind his expression, something tight and impatient there and gone before I could name it. Then the smile came back easy and warm and covered it over like it had never existed at all. I hadn't slept well after that. I'd lain in the dark for a long time listening to the city outside the window and the slow, even sound of Curtis breathing beside me. He always slept easily. He had that gift. And I had stared at the ceiling and told myself I was being irrational, that the earrings were a kind gesture from a husband who had not made many kind gestures lately, that the old man's words, the ones that had found me on a street corner 3 weeks ago, were the ramblings of a stranger I would never see again. I had almost convinced myself. Almost. But there are things your body knows before your mind catches up. There's a language your gut speaks that doesn't use words, just pressure, just weight, just a low and steady pull towards something you're not ready to name out loud. And standing in that bathroom at 6:15 in the morning, looking at a glass of water that was the wrong color in every possible way, I understood that I had known something was wrong for much longer than I had been willing to admit. The coffee maker beeped from the kitchen. One sharp sound, then silence. I didn't move. I kept my hands on the shelf. I kept my eyes on the glass. And somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the cold that had made its way all the way up to my throat, by then something else was forming. Something quieter and harder and more determined than anything I had felt in a long time. But to understand how I ended up in that bathroom holding onto a shelf like the floor might give way, I have to go back. Back past the blue velvet box. Back past the crosswalk and the old man who somehow knew my name. Back to the life I'd been living before any of this began. Because this story didn't start that Saturday morning. It started much earlier in the kind of quiet that doesn't feel like a warning until it's too late. It started with my life exactly as it was. And you need to know what that looked like first. The 6:45 bus never waited. I learned that in my first week at the firm when I stood 1 minute too long at the corner of Jefferson and 4th and watched the Route 50 pull away without me. After that, I stopped lingering. I set my alarm for 5:50, packed my lunch the night before, and walked out the door with exactly enough time, not a minute more. That was June 2024. That was my life. I worked as an accountant at a small financial consulting firm in Midtown Nashville. The office had 11 people, pale carpeting that needed replacing, and a coffee machine that made a sound like it was apologizing every time it brewed a cup. My salary was $65,000 a year. That sounds like enough until you subtract rent, utilities, groceries, and the quiet understanding that you are carrying everything alone. Sandra sat 2 desks over from me. She was the kind of person who noticed things, the kind who would set a granola bar on your desk without saying a word if she thought you looked tired. She asked me once in the break room if everything was okay at home. I told her yes. She nodded slowly the way people do when they don't fully believe you but choose to let it go. I appreciated that more than she probably knew. I took the Route 50 WeGo bus home every evening, 40 minutes from Midtown to Germantown depending on traffic. I liked that stretch of time more than I was willing to admit, the way the city blurred past the window, the hum of strangers around me, the brief permission to be no one in particular, just a woman on a bus going home. Home was a 2-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor of a brick building in Germantown, $2,200 a month. My name on the lease, my credit score that got us approved my direct deposit that covered it every first of the month. Curtis's name was on the lease too, but that was mostly a formality by then. He hadn't worked a real job in over a year. I want to be fair when I talk about Curtis, or at least I want to try. He wasn't cruel. He didn't shout, didn't break things, didn't disappear for days at a time. What he did was quieter than that, and in some ways harder to name. He spent his days on the couch with his laptop scrolling through social media, watching videos I never asked about. Every few weeks, he'd pick up a small job helping a friend move a 1-day gig at a warehouse, and whatever he made, he spent on himself. New headphones, a jacket, a dinner out that I wasn't invited to. I stopped asking about his plans sometime around January. Not because I gave up exactly, but because I got tired of the particular look he gave me when I did patient, slightly annoyed. Like I was a child asking when we'd arrive somewhere he'd already decided we weren't going. So I stopped asking. And we kept living together in a way that looked like a marriage if you didn't stand too close. Joanna would have had something to say about all of it. She always did. We had been friends since college, the kind of friendship that started over a shared aisle seat on the first day of freshman orientation, and never really ended. She moved to Seattle in the spring of 2023, chasing a promotion she deserved and a city she'd always talked about. I told her to go. I meant it. But the calls got shorter after that. Not because we loved each other less, but because life has a way of filling the spaces between people when distance is involved. She was building something real, a new city, a new rhythm, a relationship that seemed to be going somewhere. I was proud of her. I also missed her in a way I didn't say out loud. There was one evening in June when she called while I was on the bus home. I pressed the phone to my ear and watched a woman across the aisle comfort a toddler who dropped a juice box, and Joanna asked how things were going. "Fine," I said. Same how I watched the juice seep across the floor. She's building her life. I thought and felt the weight of the contrast without finishing the sentence. I'm not sure what I'm doing. I said something lighter than that. We talked for 12 minutes, and when we hung up, I stared out the window for the rest of the ride. That was the shape of my days in June. Work bus apartment silence. A husband who filled the rooms without filling the space. A friend I loved but couldn't reach the way I used to. A life I had assembled piece by piece and was only beginning to suspect didn't fit together the way I'd planned. I didn't know back then what was actually wrong. I thought the emptiness was ordinary. I thought it was just what marriage looked like after a few years, what friendship looked like across time zones, what getting older felt like when you weren't paying attention. I thought a lot of things that turned out not to be true. At night, I fell into a routine without meaning to. Dinner dishes, a little reading bed. Curtis stayed up. I could see the blue light from the crack under the office door when I walked past the glow of something I couldn't see steady and quiet. I didn't know what he was doing in there during all those nights. Back then, I told myself it didn't matter. I heard something was different before I saw it. The hallway outside our apartment had a particular smell on ordinary evenings. Floor cleaner, a trace of whatever Marlene 2 doors down had cooked for dinner. The faint mustiness of a building that was older than it looked. I had walked that hallway so many times that I processed it the way you process background noise automatically, without attention. That Friday evening, the smell hit me before I reached our door. Something heavier, deliberate. The kind of fragrance that announces itself, that takes up space in a room before the person wearing it does. I stopped for just a moment in the hallway, key in hand, and registered it the way you register a sound that doesn't belong. Not with alarm, not yet. Just with the small interior adjustment that says something here is not the same as yesterday. I stood there for 2 full seconds before I put the key in the lock. In those 2 seconds, I thought about the last time Curtis had worn cologne on a Friday evening. I thought about the new shirt I had glimpsed through the bedroom doorway 2 weeks ago, navy, still folded, pushed to the back of the shelf. I thought about Bernard at the crosswalk, his gray velvet jacket, the particular quality of his voice when he said my name. I thought about all of it in the compressed, involuntary way the mind assembles things it has been quietly collecting without your permission. Then I turned the key and opened the door. Curtis was standing in the entryway, not sitting on the couch, not at his laptop, not in the kitchen, standing the way people stand when they have been waiting and want you to know it. He was wearing the navy button-down, still carrying the faint geometry of its fold lines from the packaging. He had shaved. Not the usual 2-day maintenance shave, but a close, careful shave that left his face smooth in a way that made him look younger and somehow less familiar. He was smiling, wide, warm, open, a smile I had not seen on him in close to 2 years. "Hey," he said, "you're right on time." I didn't know what I was right on time for. I set my bag down by the door and said "hey" back because that was the word the moment called for, and I was very good by then at giving moments what they called for without giving away anything more. I looked at him the way I had been looking at him for 3 months. Not the surface look of someone going through the motions of a conversation, but the second layer of attention underneath it, the one that had been running quietly in the background since June, cataloging everything. The shirt, the shave, the cologne that was not his, the smile that was too wide and too ready, like something prepared in advance. "I got you something," he said. He produced a box from the console table behind him, small, square, wrapped in blue velvet, the kind of box that jewelry comes in when someone wants the container to do some of the work. He held it out with both hands, an offering. His smile hadn't moved. I took it. Inside, nested in a fold of white satin, was a pair of earrings. Gold drop earrings, a fine chain, descending from a small disc at the top, ending in a slightly larger element that caught the light when I tilted the box. They were delicate in the way expensive things often are. The chain was thin, almost gossamer, but the post, the part that would pass through the ear, was thicker than I would have expected, heavier looking than the rest. There was a disproportion to it that I registered without quite naming the way you register something slightly off about a photograph before you can identify what's wrong. I turned the box slightly in my hands, letting the hallway light move across the metal. "Try them on," Curtis said. He had moved slightly closer. "Go ahead. I want to see how they look." And I noticed where his eyes went when he said it. Not to my face, not to my eyes, directly to my ears. A fixed, specific attention that lasted only a second before he caught himself and looked back at me, still smiling. But I had already seen it. "When your husband gives you earrings, don't put them on." The voice arrived so clearly it was almost physical. Bernard's low, unhurried voice, the rasp at the edges, cutting straight through the warm light of the apartment and the smell of Curtis's cologne and the careful presentation of the blue velvet box. I heard it the way you hear something you've been trying not to think about arriving precisely when you can no longer avoid it. Soak them in a glass of warm water overnight. Leave them until morning. I looked at the earrings. I looked at Curtis. I smiled. It was the most deliberate smile I had ever produced, constructed from the outside and placed carefully on my face the way you place something fragile on an unstable surface. My chest was doing something complicated that I did not allow to reach my expression. "They're beautiful," I said. "I love them." "Put them on," he said again. Lighter this time, almost casual. But the word again mattered. The repetition mattered. "I want to," I said, and I kept my voice easy, kept my hands steady, kept the smile exactly where I'd put it. "But I'm still in my work clothes and my hair's a mess. I'll wear them to the office on Monday, that way I can actually do them justice. They deserve a real outfit, not this." I gestured at myself with a small, self-deprecating laugh. The kind of laugh that says I'm being modest, not evasive. The kind that closes a subject without appearing to close it. Curtis held my gaze for a moment that ran one beat longer than comfortable. His expression didn't change. Then he nodded. "Yeah, that makes sense," and moved toward the kitchen, said something about having ordered food, asked if I was hungry. I said I was. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, takeout containers between us, and we talked the way we had been talking for months. Surface conversation. The kind that fills a room without filling the silence underneath it. He mentioned something he had seen online. I asked a question I didn't care about the answer to. He laughed once at something I said. I laughed back at the right moment. We were both performing, but the audience was different. He was performing for a wife who suspected nothing. I was performing for a husband who could not know how much I had already understood. I refilled my water glass twice because my mouth kept going dry. I moved food around my plate and ate about half of it. I said the things that dinner required saying, and I smiled when smiling was required, and I did not once let my eyes go to the console table in the entryway where the blue velvet box was sitting, exactly where I had set it down. After dinner, while Curtis was in the other room, I walked back to the entryway alone. I picked up the box. I opened it and looked at them again in the dim hallway light, the thin chain, the slight gleam of gold, the post that was thicker than the rest of the piece warranted. I thought about Bernard's voice. I thought about the crosswalk on Charlotte Pike and the yellow maple leaves and the way he had disappeared into the crowd before I could ask him a single follow-up question. I thought about the fact that he had known my name before I told him anything. I thought if he was wrong, the worst outcome is that I feel foolish tomorrow morning. I thought if he was right, I didn't finish that thought. They were beautiful. They looked completely harmless. But my hands would not stop trembling. By the time June arrived, something had shifted, and I had already decided not to examine it too closely. It began with the evenings. Curtis had always been a homebody, the kind of man who complained about traffic and ordered delivery rather than drive 2 miles for dinner. So when he started going out 2 or 3 nights a week, I noticed. Not loudly. Just the way you notice a light bulb flickering once you ignore it. Twice you make a mental note. By the 3rd time, the note has become something heavier that you keep folding smaller and smaller, hoping it fits somewhere it won't take up space. He never gave a full explanation. Around 8 or 8:30, he would close his laptop, disappear into the bedroom for a few minutes, and come back out in a clean shirt. "I'm heading out." That was usually all. Sometimes not even that, just the sound of keys, the click of the front door, and then the apartment doing what it always did when he left, settling into a quiet that felt less like peace and more like held breath. He came back after 10, sometimes 11. I was in bed most of those nights or lying there with a book open on my chest, not reading. I would hear the front door open, hear him move through the apartment, the kitchen tap, running briefly, the bathroom door, the particular sequence of sounds that meant he was winding down, and I would lie still and keep my breathing even and not say anything. I had become very skilled by June at the performance of sleep. The cologne was the first specific thing I noticed, not the cedar scent I had picked out for him years ago. The bottle that sat on the bathroom shelf, still more than half full, going quietly unused. Something else. Sharper. More considered. The kind of scent a person chooses carefully, not the kind that accumulates out of habit. I caught it one evening when he leaned across me in the kitchen to grab something from the upper cabinet, and I felt my mind run a small, involuntary calculation before I could stop it. After that, I started seeing the other things I had been not seeing. His phone always face down on the coffee table, carried into the bathroom when he showered, balanced on the edge of the sink, in a way that was meant to look absent-minded, but wasn't. Tucked beneath his thigh on the couch with a casualness so deliberate it announced itself. I know the difference between someone who sets a phone down and someone who positions it. The angle is different. The stillness afterward is different. The way a person's hand lingers just a half second too long before letting go is different. I noticed all of it with the quiet, methodical attention of someone who has stopped expecting to be surprised and has started simply keeping track. I saw all of it. I said nothing. What made it stranger were the good nights. Every week or so, Curtis would come home in a mood that didn't fit too bright, too warm, like a lamp, with the wattage turned up slightly past what the room called for. On those nights, he'd stop somewhere on the way back and bring food takeout containers lined up on the counter, with a kind of deliberate care, the lids still sealed. Everything arranged as if presentation mattered. He'd ask how my day went, whether I was tired, whether work had been difficult. Small questions delivered with an attentiveness that should have felt like kindness, but landed instead like something performed for an audience of one. I watched him on those nights more carefully than on the others. The warmth that arrived with the takeout containers and disappeared again by morning. The way he asked about my day with his eyes slightly too focused, the attention slightly too sustained, the way a person listens when they are checking something rather than caring about the answer. I ate what he brought. I answered his questions. I gave the performance back to him in kind. It reminded me of something Agatha had said to me once years ago on the porch at Center Hill Lake. We were watching a heron move along the far bank slow and deliberate, and she said it so quietly it almost didn't register. When someone becomes unusually kind out of nowhere, ask yourself what they need from you. I was young when she said that. I stored it away without fully understanding it. Standing in my own kitchen in July 2024, watching Curtis arrange containers with too much intention, I understood it completely. He needed something. He had always needed something, my income, my credit, my name on the lease of an apartment I paid for, mostly alone. But this felt different in kind, more purposeful. The attentiveness wasn't affection, it was positioning. The difference between those two things I had learned was something you felt before you could name it, a slight wrongness in the temperature of a gesture, like food that looks right but tastes slightly off. I still didn't ask him anything. I want to be clear about why. It was not weakness or not only weakness. It was a particular kind of exhaustion that had been accumulating for so long it had started to feel like a personality trait. The marriage had been running below empty since at least the year Agatha passed. We shared a space and a set of routines and not much else. We had stopped talking about the future somewhere along the way, not in a single conversation, not with any kind of resolution, just a gradual mutual agreement to stop bringing it up. The way you stop mentioning a leak in the ceiling once you've accepted that no one is going to fix it. To ask the question out loud, where are you going? What is that on your collar? Who are you becoming when you leave this apartment would mean acknowledging that what I had been quietly watching fall apart had in fact fallen apart. And naming a thing changes it. Once it is spoken, it exists differently. It requires a response. It requires a decision. And I was not ready to make that decision. Sandra asked me in August in the break room at work whether everything was all right. I said yes, same as always. She looked at me the way she always did, patient, unhurried, the expression of someone who has learned that the most useful thing you can offer a person is room. I was grateful for it. I was also using her patience as a substitute for honesty, and some part of me knew that too. Joanna called that same week. We talked about her new city, a trail she had found outside Seattle, a work situation that seemed to be moving in the right direction. Her voice had the particular energy of someone whose life is gaining momentum, a quality I recognized and missed without letting myself say so. She asked about Curtis, and I said, same as always, which was both completely accurate and not accurate at all. She knew the difference. She let it go anyway because she understood that I wasn't ready, and that quiet understanding was its own kind of love, the kind that doesn't require you to be ready before it shows up. August ended. September arrived. Curtis kept going out. I kept not asking. I chose not to ask. Not because I was weak, but because deep down I already knew that the answer would break something I wasn't ready to let go of. The city had a different texture in the late afternoon. I had walked the stretch between my office building and the Route 50 stop hundreds of times enough that my feet knew the route without consulting my brain, left out the lobby door. 2 blocks south, right on Charlotte Pike, then the long diagonal toward 28th Avenue, where the bus stop sat beneath an oak tree that dropped acorns on the shelter roof when the wind picked up. I knew every uneven seam in the sidewalk. I knew which corner smelled like exhaust and which one smelled like the Thai restaurant's kitchen vent. I knew that the crosswalk signal at Charlotte and 28th ran about 12 seconds longer than it needed to. Long enough that most people had already crossed and were halfway down the block before it finished counting. That Wednesday afternoon in mid-September, I almost didn't see him. He was standing at the edge of the curb, not quite on the sidewalk, not quite in the street the way a person stands when they've made a decision and are working up to following through on it. He was slight somewhere in his mid-70s with the kind of frame that suggested he had once been a taller man and had been slowly returning to a smaller version of himself over the years. He wore a gray velvet jacket, the kind with small covered buttons down the front, worn thin at both cuffs, in the way fabric goes when it has been laundered and handled many times over many years. He was watching the traffic signal with an expression that was neither confused nor afraid, just considered. Like he was calculating something. I almost kept walking. I don't know exactly what made me stop. A habit, maybe. Agatha had always stopped. She would have stopped without thinking twice, and somewhere along the way, I had picked that up from her. The same way I had picked up her preference for strong coffee and her distrust of anything that seemed too easy. I stepped up beside him. "Would you like help crossing?" He turned to look at me. His eyes were a shade between gray and blue, the kind of color that shifts depending on the light, and sharp in a way that didn't match his posture. Not sharp like suspicion, sharp like attention, like someone who had been watching the world carefully for a very long time and had stopped being surprised by most of it. "That would be very kind," he said. His voice was steady and unhurried, a slight rasp at the edges, the kind that comes from decades of use rather than from anything wrong. The signal changed. I offered my arm and he took it. His grip lighter than I expected, but sure the grip of someone who knew exactly how much he needed and didn't take more. We stepped off the curb together, his pace slower than mine, measured and deliberate, each step placed with the kind of care that suggested he trusted the ground but wanted to be certain of it first. We were about halfway across when he stopped. Not because of traffic, not because of anything in the road. He simply stopped walking, turned his head, and looked directly at me, and the quality of his attention changed entirely. The careful peripheral awareness of an elderly man navigating a crosswalk became something else, something focused and still, and I had the sudden disorienting feeling that this was what he had been waiting to do. "Olivia," he said. The sound of my name in his mouth stopped me completely. "When your husband gives you earrings," he said, his voice low but clear beneath the ambient noise of the intersection, "don't put them on. Soak them in a glass of warm water overnight. Leave them until morning." He held my gaze without blinking. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" The light was still green. Somewhere behind us, a car had slowed. The world kept moving in its ordinary directions, and I was standing in the middle of a crosswalk in Midtown Nashville, completely unable to account for what was happening. "How do you know my name?" My voice came out smaller than I intended. He didn't answer that. He asked instead, "Do you trust me?" I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I don't think I said anything at all. And then he turned forward again and resumed walking the same careful pace, the same measured steps, as if the previous 15 seconds had been entirely routine. We reached the far curb. I steadied him up the small step onto the sidewalk. He released my arm with a slight nod, the kind of nod that functions as both thank you and goodbye. And then he moved into the current of the afternoon crowd. That gray velvet jacket disappearing between a woman with a stroller and two men in work shirts, and within seconds, he was simply gone. I turned back. I scanned the crosswalk, the median, the sidewalk on the other side. A gust of wind moved a cluster of yellow maple leaves across the pavement. The Route 50 stop sat 50 feet ahead, ordinary as always. There was no sign of him. I stood there for a moment longer than made sense. A man in a delivery uniform stepped around me with a brief, impatient look. The city continued at its usual pace, completely indifferent to the fact that something had just shifted in a way I couldn't explain. He had known my name. I was completely certain of that. Not a guess, not a misheard word, not some confusion with someone else. He had said it the way you say someone's name when you already know them, not as a question, not as a greeting, but as a statement of fact. Olivia. I walked to the bus stop. I found a seat on the Route 50 and watched Nashville move past the window the way it always did, and I told myself it was nothing, a strange encounter. An old man who had perhaps overheard something or confused me with someone else, or simply existed on the particular outer edge of ordinary that some people occupy. I told myself that for the entire 40-minute ride home, but I could not stop hearing it. Olivia. He had said my name, and I had never seen that man before in my entire life. I heard something was different before I saw it. The hallway outside our apartment had a particular smell on ordinary evening's floor cleaner, a trace of whatever Marlene 2 doors down had cooked for dinner, the faint mustiness of a building that was older than it looked. I had walked that hallway so many times that I processed it the way you process background noise automatically without attention. That Friday evening, the smell hit me before I reached our door. Something heavier, deliberate. The kind of fragrance that announces itself that takes up space in a room before the person wearing it does. I stopped for just a moment in the hallway, key in hand, and registered it the way you register a sound that doesn't belong. Not with alarm, not yet. Just with the small interior adjustment that says something here is not the same as yesterday. I stood there for 2 full seconds before I put the key in the lock. In those 2 seconds, I thought about the last time Curtis had worn cologne on a Friday evening. I thought about the new shirt I had glimpsed through the bedroom doorway 2 weeks ago, navy, still folded, pushed to the back of the shelf. I thought about Bernard at the crosswalk, his gray velvet jacket, the particular quality of his voice when he said my name. I thought about all of it in the compressed, involuntary way the mind assembles things it has been quietly collecting without your permission. Then I turned the key and opened the door. Curtis was standing in the entryway, not sitting on the couch, not at his laptop, not in the kitchen, standing the way people stand when they have been waiting and want you to know it. He was wearing the navy button-down, still carrying the faint geometry of its fold lines from the packaging. He had shaved. Not the usual 2-day maintenance shave, but a close, careful shave that left his face smooth in a way that made him look younger and somehow less familiar. He was smiling, wide, warm, open, a smile I had not seen on him in close to 2 years. "Hey," he said, "you're right on time." I didn't know what I was right on time for. I set my bag down by the door and said hey back because that was the word the moment called for. And I was very good by then at giving moments what they called for without giving away anything more. I looked at him the way I had been looking at him for 3 months, not the surface look of someone going through the motions of a conversation, but the second layer of attention underneath it, the one that had been running quietly in the background since June, cataloging everything. The shirt, the shave, the cologne that was not his, the smile that was too wide and too ready like something prepared in advance. "I got you something," he said. He produced a box from the console table behind him, small square wrapped in blue velvet, the kind of box that jewelry comes in when someone wants the container to do some of the work. He held it out with both hands, an offering. His smile hadn't moved. I took it. Inside, nested in a fold of white satin, was a pair of earrings. Gold drop earrings, a fine chain descending from a small disc at the top, ending in a slightly larger element that caught the light when I tilted the box. They were delicate in the way expensive things often are. The chain was thin, almost gossamer. But the post, the part that would pass through the ear, was thicker than I would have expected, heavier looking than the rest. There was a disproportion to it that I registered without quite naming the way you register something slightly off about a photograph before you can identify what's wrong. I turned the box slightly in my hands, letting the hallway light move across the metal. "Try them on," Curtis said. He had moved slightly closer. "Go ahead. I want to see how they look." And I noticed where his eyes went when he said it. Not to my face, not to my eyes, directly to my ears. A fixed, specific attention that lasted only a second before he caught himself and looked back at me, still smiling. But I had already seen it. "When your husband gives you earrings, don't put them on." The voice arrived so clearly, it was almost physical. Bernard's low, unhurried voice, the rasp at the edges, cutting straight through the warm light of the apartment and the smell of Curtis's cologne and the careful presentation of the blue velvet box. I heard it the way you hear something you've been trying not to think about arriving precisely when you can no longer avoid it. Soak them in a glass of warm water overnight. Leave them until morning. I looked at the earrings. I looked at Curtis. I smiled. It was the most deliberate smile I had ever produced, constructed from the outside and placed carefully on my face the way you place something fragile on an unstable surface. My chest was doing something complicated that I did not allow to reach my expression. "They're beautiful," I said. "I love them." "Put them on," he said again, lighter this time, almost casual. But the word again mattered. The repetition mattered. "I want to," I said, and I kept my voice easy, kept my hands steady, kept the smile exactly where I'd put it. "But I'm still in my work clothes and my hair's a mess. I'll wear them to the office on Monday, that way I can actually do them justice. They deserve a real outfit, not this." I gestured at myself with a small, self-deprecating laugh, the kind of laugh that says I'm being modest, not evasive, the kind that closes a subject without appearing to close it. Curtis held my gaze for a moment that ran one beat longer than comfortable. His expression didn't change. Then he nodded. "Yeah, that makes sense," and moved toward the kitchen, said something about having ordered food, asked if I was hungry. I said I was. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, takeout containers between us, and we talked the way we had been talking for months, surface conversation, the kind that fills a room without filling the silence underneath it. He mentioned something he had seen online. I asked a question I didn't care about the answer to. He laughed once at something I said. I laughed back at the right moment. We were both performing, but the audience was different. He was performing for a wife who suspected nothing. I was performing for a husband who could not know how much I had already understood. I refilled my water glass twice because my mouth kept going dry. I moved food around my plate and ate about half of it. I said the things that dinner required saying, and I smiled when smiling was required. And I did not once let my eyes go to the console table in the entryway, where the blue velvet box was sitting, exactly where I had set it down. After dinner, while Curtis was in the other room, I walked back to the entryway alone. I picked up the box. I opened it and looked at them again in the dim hallway light, the thin chain, the slight gleam of gold, the post that was thicker than the rest of the piece warranted. I thought about Bernard's voice. I thought about the crosswalk on Charlotte Pike and the yellow maple leaves and the way he had disappeared into the crowd before I could ask him a single follow-up question. I thought about the fact that he had known my name before I told him anything. I thought if he was wrong, the worst outcome is that I feel foolish tomorrow morning. I thought if he was right, I didn't finish that thought. They were beautiful. They looked completely harmless. but my hands would not stop trembling. The snoring started around 10:30. Curtis had always been a heavy sleeper, the kind who was out within minutes of lying down and stayed that way, regardless of what was happening around him. Under other circumstances, I had found it oddly reassuring, that ability to simply switch off. That night, listening to the steady rhythm coming through the bedroom wall, it felt like something else, like the sound of someone who had nothing on his conscience keeping him awake. I was sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. Not complete dark, the small light above the stove was on the one we left burning at night out of habit, casting a low amber glow across the counter and the edge of the table. Enough light to see by, not enough to feel fully present in. The blue velvet box sat in front of me closed. The glass of water was beside it, one of the thick-bottomed tumblers from the cabinet above the sink filled with warm water from the tap. The kind of warm that sits just above room temperature and would hold its heat for a while. I had filled it 20 minutes ago. I had been sitting here since. I was having an argument with myself, and neither side was winning. He's a stranger, said the reasonable part of my brain, the part that had spent 11 years building a career out of evaluating evidence and drawing measured conclusions. You helped him cross a street. You don't know anything about him. He said your name people overhear things, see name badges, make lucky guesses. There is no rational basis for what you're considering doing. And then the other part, quieter but more persistent, Curtis wore a new shirt. He shaved close. He smelled like someone else's taste. He watched your ears, not your face. He asked you twice. I picked up the box and opened it. The earrings caught the amber light the way they had caught the hallway light earlier, that same fine gleam, the thin chain, the element at the bottom that moved slightly when I tilted the box. They were genuinely beautiful. That was the part that made the whole thing harder to hold in my mind at once, that something could be beautiful and also be the thing you were afraid of. I had always assumed those two qualities canceled each other out. I lifted one earring between my thumb and forefinger and held it up toward the light. The post was thicker than it needed to be. I had noticed it when Curtis first opened the box, and I noticed it again now more deliberately. A drop earrings post exists only to pass through the ear and hold the piece in place. It should be the thinnest part of the design, the most functional, the least visible. This one had a weight to it that the rest of the earring didn't warrant. A slight heaviness, a density that didn't match the delicacy of the chain above it. I couldn't tell you exactly what I was looking at. I'm not a jeweler, I don't have the vocabulary for it. All I had was the feeling that the proportions were slightly wrong, the way a sentence can be grammatically correct and still sound off to someone who reads enough. I set the first earring down on the table. I picked up the second one and looked at it the same way. Same weight, same disproportion at the post. I sat with both of them in my open palm for a long moment. Then I picked them up one at a time and dropped them into the glass of water. They made almost no sound going in, just the faint break of a surface. Two small ripples spreading outward from the center and dissolving before they reached the sides of the glass. The earrings settled at the bottom, the chain coiling loosely, the post pointing upward at a slight angle. The water was clear. Everything looked exactly as it should. I covered the glass with a small saucer from the drying rack, the blue-rimmed one that had been Agatha's, that I'd brought from the lake house without thinking too hard about why, and carried it carefully to the bathroom. I opened the medicine cabinet and set the glass on the back shelf behind the ibuprofen and the box of bandages where it wouldn't be visible at a glance. I closed the cabinet door. I stood at the bathroom sink for a moment and looked at myself in the mirror. My face looked the way it always looked at this hour, tired around the eyes. Hair pulled back, the particular flatness of expression that comes at the end of a long week. I didn't look like a woman doing something significant. I looked like a woman who had brushed her teeth and was about to go to bed. Maybe that was all this was. I turned off the bathroom light and walked back to the bedroom. Curtis was still on his side, breathing deeply, one arm thrown over his pillow. I slid in on my side without disturbing him and lay on my back, looking up at the ceiling in the dark. The apartment was quiet except for his breathing. I thought about Bernard, his gray velvet jacket, his unhurried voice, the way he had held my gaze in the middle of that crosswalk without any trace of urgency, just certainty. I thought about the post on that earring, heavier than it should have been. I thought about the new shirt and the careful shave, and the way Curtis had said, "Go ahead, try them on twice in the space of 2 minutes." I told myself there was probably a simple explanation for all of it. That by morning, the water would still be clear, I would take the earrings out of the glass and dry them off, and I would wear them to work on Monday and feel mildly foolish about the whole thing. I would owe some version of an apology to a stranger I would never see again. I almost believed that. If the water was still clear in the morning, I would apologize to the old man in my head, put the earrings on, and go to work like nothing had happened. That's what I told myself. I nearly believed it. If you've made it this far, you already know that glass of water means something. Drop a comment and tell me what you think is waiting for her on the other side of that bathroom door. I'd love to read your guesses. And before we go further, parts of this story have been fictionalized for storytelling purposes. If that's not your preference, no hard feelings. But if you're staying, things are about to get a lot more interesting. I woke at 5:58 without an alarm. The bedroom was still dark. Curtis was beside me, breathing in the slow, even rhythm of someone with nothing pressing on his sleep. I lay still for a moment with my eyes open, aware of the glass sitting in the medicine cabinet, the way you are aware of something unresolved, present even when you're not looking at it. Then I got up. I moved carefully across the bedroom, avoiding the 2 floorboards I knew by memory, and eased the door shut behind me without letting the latch click. The hallway was dim and cool. The stove light was still on in the kitchen, the same low amber I had left burning the night before. I walked past it without slowing and went straight to the bathroom. I turned the lock, and for a moment I just stood there with my back against the door hands at my sides, breathing. Then I opened the medicine cabinet. The glass was exactly where I had left it, the small saucer balanced on top undisturbed. I lifted it with both hands and carried it to the narrow window above the toilet, the east-facing one that caught the morning's first light before the rest of the apartment woke up. Outside, the sky was pale gray, the sun not yet fully arrived. I raised the glass toward that thin, early light. I had spent most of the night telling myself the water would be clear. It was not clear. The color stopped me before anything else did. A deep, murky yellow, not slightly off. Not faintly cloudy, but fully discolored the way water looks when something has dissolved completely into it that was never meant to be there. Dense at the bottom, diffusing upward in a slow gradient toward the surface. When I tilted the glass a fraction, the liquid moved with a heaviness that clean water doesn't have. It clung to the inside of the glass in a thin film before sliding reluctantly back down. I stood there holding it and made myself keep looking rather than put it down. I brought the glass closer to the window and looked at the earrings resting on the bottom. The chains had settled the same way as the night before, loose, coiled gently against the glass. But the posts had changed. On the first earring, there was a separation along the side of the post, a line running lengthwise, where something had come open during the night. Not a crack, not water damage. A seam. A deliberately constructed channel, precise and intentional, that had released whatever was sealed inside it into the surrounding warmth over hours. The second earring was the same seam, the same careful construction, the residue still dispersing in slow threads near the bottom, catching the pale light in a way that looked almost delicate, almost beautiful. That was the most wrong thing about it. I set the glass down on the edge of the sink and put both hands on the rim of the basin. The post had been built to press against skin, my skin, the thin tissue behind the earlobe where the surface is close to everything beneath it, and the body's warmth is steady and constant. It would have sat there all day on the bus to Midtown at my desk, through 8 hours of work on the ride home in the evening, pressing warming, releasing the compound inside it, slowly and continuously, against the exact place the body takes things in most readily. Someone had understood that. Someone had understood the specific location, the thin skin, the vessels close to the surface, and had engineered a mechanism around that understanding, had filled it with care, had placed it in a blue velvet box and handed it across a hallway with a wide smile and both hands extended and said, "Go ahead, try them on." Twice. My husband had done that. I stood at the sink and breathed and did not let myself fall apart because he was 20 feet away on the other side of a wall, and I needed every part of my mind working in the same direction. I needed to think past the next minute, past the next hour, past the version of this morning I had imagined while I was still lying in the dark beside him. I needed a plan, or at least the beginning of one, and I had maybe 60 seconds before the silence in the apartment started to mean something. I thought about the glass, the yellow water, the open seam, the way his eyes had gone to my ears, not my face, not my expression, but specifically my ears when he held out the box. I thought about Bernard, the crosswalk. Do you trust me? I thought yes. I should have said yes. The knock came without warning. 3 light raps on the bathroom door. Not impatient, not urgent. Casual, the kind of knock a person makes when they're simply checking on something they expect to find in order. And then his voice, even and unhurried, carrying none of the roughness that early morning should have left in it. "Olivia, you okay in there?" I looked up at the mirror above the sink. My face looked back at me pale, very still, the face of someone who's just been handed something she cannot set down. I held it for 2 seconds. Then I made it into something else, something neutral, something that belonged to a woman going about an ordinary Saturday morning, no different from any other. I thought about what was sitting on the edge of the sink behind me. I thought about what it meant. "I'm fine," I said, "just getting ready." My voice came out completely steady. I did not recognize it as mine. I had 30 seconds to decide what to do next. I opened the bathroom door. Curtis was standing in the hallway with a mug of coffee in one hand, shoulder leaning against the wall at an angle that looked casual, but wasn't the angle of someone who had positioned himself there and then arranged himself to seem like he hadn't. He was watching the bathroom door. Not the kitchen, not his phone, not the middle distance the way people look when they're simply waiting. The door. "Morning," he said, the same even tone from 30 seconds ago through the wood. "Morning," I said back. I walked past him toward the bedroom to get dressed, and I felt his eyes follow me the way you feel a draft, not seeing it, just aware of the direction it's coming from. We had breakfast at the kitchen table 20 minutes later. Curtis had made eggs, which he did occasionally on weekends when he was in a particular kind of mood. The domestic, surface-level warmth that I had learned over the past few months to read as performance rather than impulse. He set a plate in front of me without being asked. He refilled my coffee. He asked whether I had slept well. I said I had. I asked whether he had. He said yes. We ate. Outside the kitchen window, Nashville was doing what it did on Saturday mornings, a neighbor's dog somewhere below the distant rhythm of a lawnmower starting up 2 streets over. The particular quality of weekend light that fell differently than weekday light, slower and less purposeful. Under any other circumstances, it would have been ordinary. It was the most ordinary-looking 30 minutes of my life. I watched him the entire time. Not openly, I wasn't staring, wasn't tracking his movements in any way he could have named, but I was watching. Every time he reached for his mug, I watched his hands. Every time he looked out the window, I watched the angle of his jaw. I was cataloging things I had spent months not allowing myself to examine, and now that I had permission, I couldn't stop. He asked about the earrings halfway through breakfast. Did you put them somewhere safe? He said it lightly, conversationally, the way you ask about something you're mildly concerned about. Real gold scratches easily. You don't want them loose in a drawer. I looked at him across the table. They're in the box, I said, in the top drawer of the dresser. He nodded a small, satisfied nod, the kind that closes a subject, and looked back down at his plate. I thought about the Ziploc bag I hadn't packed yet. I thought about the lab on Murfreesboro Pike. I thought about the way he had said real gold with the particular emphasis of someone who had paid a great deal for something and expected a return on it. I was thinking I'd wear them to dinner this weekend, I said. If we go somewhere nice, yeah, he said, that'd be good. He smiled at me, warm, easy, the smile from the night before, and took a sip of coffee. I smiled back. I was getting better at that. After breakfast, I told him I was going to get dressed and run to Kroger before it got busy. He was already moving toward the couch, laptop open, settling into the shapeless middle portion of his Saturday the way he always did. He said, "Grab some of those crackers I like," without looking up. I said I would. In the bedroom, I moved quickly and quietly. From the back of my closet shelf behind a stack of old work folders, I retrieved 2 large Ziploc bags I had thought to take from the kitchen drawer the night before after Curtis fell asleep. I went to the bathroom, lifted the glass carefully from the edge of the sink where I had left it, and sealed it inside the first bag. Then placed that bag inside the second and pressed the seal closed along every inch of it. I wrapped the whole thing in a layer of paper towels, not for insulation, just to make it look like nothing in particular, and set it at the bottom of the old brown tote bag I used for grocery runs. I changed into jeans and a sweatshirt. I pulled my hair back. I checked my reflection once, not for vanity, just to confirm that my face looked the way I needed it to look, which was unremarkable. Then I walked back to the living room. Curtis was on the couch, headphones half on something playing on his laptop that I didn't try to see. I picked up my keys from the hook by the door and I leaned down and pressed my lips to his cheek. He made a small sound of acknowledgement without lifting his eyes from the screen. I straightened up. I stood there for just a moment. 1 beat, maybe 2, holding the brown tote against my side. I didn't know why I had kissed him. Habit, maybe. The body going through a motion the mind had already moved past. Or maybe it was something else, a kind of goodbye to something that had already ended long before this morning. Something I had been pretending was still alive out of exhaustion or stubbornness, or the simple human unwillingness to admit that a thing you chose is not what you thought it was. I walked out the front door. I took the stairs down 2 flights to the building entrance and pushed through into the cool September morning. My car was in the small lot off the alley behind the building. I unlocked it, set the tote bag on the passenger seat, and pulled out onto the street. Metro Nashville Public Health Laboratory was on Murfreesboro Pike, about 15 minutes from Germantown without traffic. On a Saturday morning, it was closer to 12. I did not look back at the building. I did not turn on the radio. I just drove. The man at the intake counter didn't look up when he took the bag. He set it on the scale, typed something, printed a barcode label, and pressed it onto the outside of the outer bag with the flat of his thumb. He slid a form across the counter and pointed to 3 lines that needed my signature. I signed. He tore off the bottom portion and handed it back to me, a small white receipt with a case number printed in the corner. 2 to 3 weeks, he said, already reaching for the next item on the counter. I folded the receipt and put it in my wallet behind my library card where I wouldn't see it every time I opened the flap. Then I walked back out to the parking lot on Murfreesboro Pike, got in my car, and sat there for a few minutes without starting the engine. 7 to 10 business days. I had to go home and be a wife for 2 to 3 weeks. I started the car and drove back to Germantown. The first 2 days were a Saturday and Sunday, which was its own particular kind of difficult. Weekdays had structure. The alarm, the bus, the office, the commute back scaffolding that held the hours in place. Weekends had no scaffolding. Just the 2 of us in the apartment moving around each other in the way we had been moving around each other for months, except that now every ordinary moment had a second layer underneath it that only I could see. Saturday evening, Curtis suggested going out to dinner. He mentioned a place on Broadway he'd been wanting to try, said it would be good to do something. Said it casually, the way he said most things. "Wear the earrings," he added. "It's a nice enough place." I said my ears had been bothering me a slight tenderness, probably from the inexpensive pair I'd worn last week. I touched my earlobe briefly the way a person does when something actually hurts, and watched him absorb the excuse. "Of course," he said. "Some other time?" We went to dinner. We sat across from each other at a table near the window, and he ordered a drink, and I ordered water, and we talked about things I cannot now fully reconstruct, something about a mutual acquaintance. Something about a television show, the easy conversational filler that 2 people produce when they have run out of the real kind. He laughed at something the waiter said. I laughed at the right moments. We were both performing, but only one of us knew the other one was. I ordered the salmon, I moved it around my plate and ate about half. By Wednesday, day 5, I was sleeping in pieces. An hour, sometimes 2, and then awake in the dark with my mind running the same loop it had been running since Saturday morning. The lab, the receipt in my wallet, the compound dispersing in that yellow water, Curtis breathing beside me, slow and undisturbed. Sandra caught it at the office that afternoon in the break room while we were both waiting for the coffee machine to finish its cycle. "You look like you haven't slept in days, hon." She said it quietly, without drama, the way Sandra said most things, direct but gentle, leaving space for whatever I wanted to do with it. "I haven't been sleeping great," I said. "Just one of those stretches." She looked at me for a moment with that particular expression of hers, patient, not pushing, giving me room. "Okay," she said. "I'm here if you need anything." I nodded and took my coffee back to my desk. That evening, I almost called Joanna. I got as far as pulling up her name on my phone and holding it for a full minute, thinking about what I would even say. I think something is wrong with my husband. I think the earrings he gave me were designed to make me sick. I submitted a water sample to a public health lab, and I've been pretending everything is normal for 5 days. I couldn't find the version of that which sounded like something you said out loud to another person. I put my phone face down on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling until I fell asleep. Day 8 was a Monday. I was in the kitchen making coffee before work when Curtis came up behind me. He put one hand on my shoulder, the left one his touch light and unhurried, and stood there for a moment. "You seem really worn out lately," he said. His voice was soft, concerned almost, the kind of concern that would have sounded like care if I had heard it 4 months ago. "You should take better care of yourself." I kept my hands on the counter. I kept my eyes on the coffee maker. "I know," I said. "Work's been a lot." He gave my shoulder a brief squeeze and stepped back toward the table. I stood at the counter after he sat down, and I breathed slowly through the cold that had moved through me from the shoulder down. The cold that had nothing to do with the temperature in the kitchen and everything to do with what I understood him to have meant. "You seem really worn out." Not a concern, a measurement. He was checking something. I poured my coffee and sat across from him and ate breakfast and said the things that breakfast required saying. Day 10 was a Wednesday. I was at my desk in Midtown halfway through a quarterly reconciliation that I had been working on in the same distracted, fragmented way I had been working on everything for the past week and a half. The clock on my screen said 4:17 in the afternoon. The office around me had the low, winding down energy of a Wednesday late afternoon, a phone ringing somewhere down the hall, the sound of Sandra's chair, the hum of the building doing what buildings do. My phone vibrated on the desk beside my keyboard. I looked at the screen. The number was one I had saved under no name, just the lab's main line that I had looked up and stored the morning I submitted the sample stored, and then tried not to look at every time I unlocked my phone, which had not entirely worked. 10 days of pretending. 10 days of watching every expression that crossed his face and choosing every word that left my mouth. 10 days of sleeping beside someone I was no longer certain I had ever known. It had come down to this moment. I picked up the phone. The voice on the other end was professional and careful in the way that voices get when they have something significant to say and have been trained not to say it over the phone. "Ms. Olivia, this is the Any Lab test now on Murfreesboro Pikex Health Department calling regarding case number." She read the number, submitted October 1st. "We'd like to ask you to come in to receive your results in person. Would you be available this afternoon?" I said yes. I said I could be there in 20 minutes. She said someone would be at the intake desk to assist me. She did not say anything else. I shut my laptop, told Sandra something had come up, and left the office with my coat half on. The lab was quieter in the late afternoon than it had been on the Saturday morning I had first walked through the doors. A different attendant this time, older. A woman with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, who checked my case number, disappeared through a door behind the counter, and returned with a sealed manila envelope. She asked me to sign a form confirming receipt. I signed. She did not tell me what was inside. That was apparently not her role. I carried the envelope out to the parking lot and got into my car. I sat there with the envelope on the passenger seat for a moment. The lot on Murfreesboro Pike had maybe a dozen other cars in it, a delivery van idling near the far exit, a woman loading groceries 2 spaces over, a man in a reflective vest eating something from a paper bag on the hood of his truck. Ordinary afternoon, ordinary people, none of them aware that I was sitting 6 feet away holding something I was not sure I was ready to open. I opened it. The report was 3 pages on Any Lab tests now on Murfreesboro. PEAKIC's health department, letterhead dense with technical language and reference ranges and notation I had to read slowly to follow. I am an accountant. I am comfortable with documents. But my hands were not steady when I unfolded those pages, and I had to stop twice and wait for them to settle before I could read the lines in front of me without the words blurring. The findings were on the second page. Thallium present at levels significantly exceeding established safety thresholds for dermal exposure. Arsenic present at concentrations consistent with acute rather than ambient contamination. Both compounds identified in water sample and on submitted items. Method of release consistent with a slow dissolution mechanism activated by sustained contact with body temperature warmth. And then the sentence I read 3 times. The delivery mechanism is consistent with being intentionally designed to facilitate slow transdermal release through maintained contact with body temperature surfaces. Intentionally designed. I set the pages down on the passenger seat and looked out through the windshield at the parking lot. The delivery van had pulled out. The woman with the groceries was gone. The man in the reflective vest was still on the hood of his truck, finishing whatever was in his paper bag, completely unaware that 20 feet away someone was sitting very still with a document in her lap that had just confirmed the thing she had spent 10 days hoping was not true. I sat there for 20 minutes without moving, intentionally designed. Someone had researched this, had sourced the compounds, had understood the specific properties of the tissue behind the earlobe, the thinness of the skin, the proximity of the capillaries, the way sustained warmth accelerates absorption, had commissioned a piece of jewelry built around that knowledge, had placed it in a velvet box and handed it over with a smile and asked twice to see it worn. Someone who knew my name, my address, my schedule when I left for work, which route I took, how long I was gone. Someone who knew that my grandmother had left me a house on Center Hill Lake worth $600,000 and that I had refused to sell it. I started the car. Metro Nashville Police Department North Precinct at 26th Avenue North, about 12 minutes from the lab without traffic. I had never been inside a police station before that afternoon. I had imagined it as louder than it was, all hard surfaces and urgency. It was mostly fluorescent lighting and the sound of keyboards and someone down the hall laughing at something. The desk officer directed me to a waiting area. 12 minutes later, a man came through the side door and introduced himself. Detective Callahan was younger than I had expected, somewhere around 35, close-cropped hair, a dark jacket that looked like it had been dry cleaned sometime this year. He had the particular quality of stillness that some people in that profession develop, not passive, not relaxed, just economical, like he had learned to hold himself in reserve until he needed to move. He brought me to a small office off the main room, closed the door, and put a legal pad on the table between us. "Take your time," he said. "Start wherever feels right." I started at the beginning. I told him about Bernard at the crosswalk and the warning I had almost dismissed. I told him about the blue velvet box and the way Curtis had watched my ears. I told him about the glass of warm water and what I had found in the morning. I told him about 10 days of pretending and the envelope I had just opened in a parking lot on Murfreesboro Pike. I set the sealed Ziploc bag on the table. I set the manila envelope beside it. Callahan didn't reach for either one immediately. He read his notes. He asked 2 clarifying questions, the date of the lab submission, the exact words Curtis had used when he asked about the earrings on day 8. He wrote the answers down. Then he opened the envelope and read. He was quiet for the length of the second page. When he reached the sentence, the one about intentional design, he stopped. He looked up at me over the report. "Ms. Olivia," he said, "do you understand what this document indicates?" I held his gaze. "It indicates that my husband intended to harm me." He looked at me for a moment longer. Then he nodded once and reached for the phone on the corner of the desk. "We're opening a formal investigation tonight," he said to whoever answered. His voice was the same measured, unhurried tone it had been since he introduced himself, as if this were simply the next step in a sequence that had always been going to lead here. I sat in that chair across from him and felt something shift inside me. Not relief was too light a word for what that moment held. Something harder than that. something that had been forming for 10 days in the space between pretending and knowing, and had finally arrived at the shape it was going to keep. It felt like the beginning of a decision I was not going to take back. The call came at 7:43 on a Tuesday morning in mid-November. I was still in the kitchen, coffee in hand coat, not yet on running about 4 minutes behind my usual schedule. The caller ID showed the North Precinct's main line, a number I had saved the evening I first walked into that office and hadn't been able to stop recognizing on my screen since. I set my coffee down and answered. "Good morning, Miss Olivia. It's Callahan. Do you have a few minutes?" I sat down at the kitchen table. Through the wall, I could hear nothing Curtis had left earlier than usual that morning, which had become its own kind of pattern over the past several weeks. His departures shifting earlier and his returns later in a rhythm I had stopped trying to track. The apartment was quiet. I said I had time. "We've made some progress," Callahan said. He had a way of delivering information that was measured without being withholding, giving you exactly enough to follow, never more than the moment required. "I'd like to walk you through what we've found." He started with the camera footage. A security camera mounted above the entrance of a dry cleaner on Charlotte Pike, 2 storefronts down from a small jewelry shop approximately 6 weeks earlier. Gerald's system ran on a 90-day retention loop. The footage was still there. Barely called Gerald's Fine Repairs had captured Curtis entering that shop approximately 6 weeks before I submitted the water sample to the lab. The timestamp placed the visit on a Saturday morning in mid-August. Curtis was on camera for 47 minutes. He left carrying the same item he had brought in. The shop belonged to Gerald, 55 years old, sole proprietor, 22 years at that location. Callahan had interviewed him twice. Gerald remembered the job. A man had come in Curtis, though Gerald had known him only by first name, carrying a pair of gold drop earrings and a very small sealed vial. He had a specific request. He wanted the post of each earring hollowed out and fitted with a mechanism that would open slowly under sustained warmth, a heat-activated release built into the metal itself. The channel would need to be sealed so that the contents would dissolve gradually rather than all at once. Curtis had given Gerald a reason. He said his wife suffered from chronic fatigue, that her specialist had recommended a transdermal approach using a particular compound, and that wearing it as jewelry would allow for consistent, low-level skin contact throughout the day. He said the therapist had suggested it. He said it with the particular confidence of a man explaining something technical to someone he assumes won't look it up. Gerald had not looked it up. The request was unusual. Gerald told Callahan that in 22 years he had never received anything quite like it, but it didn't cross any line he recognized as a line. A custom modification, unusual materials, a client with a ready explanation. He completed the work in 3 days. While Gerald was working on the earrings on the second day, a Thursday afternoon, a woman had stopped by the shop. Her name, Gerald said, was Lorraine. She was a friend of his from his earlier years in the trade, someone he had known for a long time, who occasionally dropped in when she was in the neighborhood. She was around 70, he said, silver-haired. She had a way of looking at a piece of jewelry the way people look at something they understand deeply without needing to be told what they're seeing. On that Thursday, she had seen the earrings on Gerald's workbench. She had asked about them not casually. Callahan said, she had picked one up and examined the post with the kind of attention that wasn't curiosity, more like recognition. Gerald had told her everything, the client's name, the request, the vial, the explanation about the wife, the accountant, the chronic fatigue, the house on Center Hill Lake. The client was hoping to sell soon. He had no reason not to. Lorraine was an old friend. It was an interesting job. Lorraine had stood very still for a long time looking at the earring in her hand. Then she had set it down carefully on the workbench, said goodbye to Gerald, and walked out of the shop. She had not said anything about what she was thinking. She had not told Gerald what she intended to do. She had simply left. "Do you know anyone by the name of Lorraine?" Callahan asked. "A woman approximately 70 years old, possibly connected to the jewelry trade or to someone in your family's history." I thought about it. I went through the names. I knew Agatha's friends, the neighbors at Center Hill Lake. The people from my mother's side of the family that I had met over the years at holidays and funerals and the occasional Sunday afternoon. I went through the colleagues I had known, the acquaintances, the people who had drifted through my life and out the other side. Nothing. No, I said. I don't. I've never heard that name before. Callahan paused. We're working on locating her. I wanted to make sure you didn't have any prior connection before we proceed. I said I was certain. He said he would be in touch and ended the call. I sat at the kitchen table with my phone in my hand and the coffee going cold in front of me. I did not know who Lorraine was. I had never heard her name, but she had been standing in that shop while the earrings were still on the workbench, before they were finished, before they were handed over, before any of this had happened to me, and she had understood from the post of one earring held in her hand for 30 seconds. Exactly what I had needed a glass of warm water and 10 sleepless nights to figure out. She had set it down and walked out and done something with what she knew. She had done something that had reached me at a crosswalk in Midtown Nashville on a Wednesday afternoon in September, through an old man in a gray velvet jacket, who had known my name. Callahan said they were looking for her. I set my phone down on the table and sat there without moving. Callahan's office looked the same as it had the first time I had sat in it. The same fluorescent overhead light, the same legal pad on the desk, the same quality of contained, purposeful quiet. What was different was the folder on the table between us. He opened it without preamble. The photograph on top was printed on standard paper, slightly glossy, the kind of image pulled from surveillance or a social media source, rather than taken by hand. It showed the interior of a restaurant, warm lighting, exposed brick, the kind of East Nashville place that fills up on Friday evenings and has a wait list by 8 o'clock. 2 people at a table near the window. Curtis on the left, leaning slightly forward, his elbow on the table. A woman across from him, dark hair cut short just below her jaw, a glass of wine near her hand. The date stamp in the corner read January of this year, 10 months ago. I looked at the photograph for a long time without speaking. I had never seen her before. Her face meant nothing to me, no flicker of recognition, no half memory from a party or an office gathering or a name mentioned in passing. She was entirely unknown to me, but the way Curtis was looking at her that I recognized. There was something open in his expression that I hadn't seen directed at me in 3 years or more. Not just attention, something warmer than attention, more deliberate. The kind of look a person gives someone they have chosen repeatedly and consciously over everything else available to them. I had been on the receiving end of that look once, a long time ago. Her name is Tara, Callahan said. 30 years old. She lives in East Nashville. She has a background in biochemistry, 2 years of graduate coursework before she left the program. She had spent 3 years as a lab technician at a private pharmaceutical research contractor in Brentwood. Before leaving the position 8 months earlier, access to controlled chemical compounds had been part of her daily routine. He let that sit for a moment. Encrypted messages between her and Curtis go back 10 months. She was the one who sourced the substances used in the earrings. Curtis designed the delivery mechanism with her guidance. I kept my eyes on the photograph. How long have they been planning this, based on the message history, since approximately January, the same month this photograph was taken? 10 months. While I had been riding the Route 50 bus to work and eating dinner at our kitchen table and carrying the apartment on my salary, they had been building a plan that required my slow, gradual deterioration as its first step. Callahan walked me through it methodically, the way he did everything without drama, without editorializing, just the sequence of what had been found and what it indicated. The plan, as the message history laid it out, I would wear the earrings daily. The compounds inside the posts would absorb through the skin over weeks, not days, slow enough that the onset would look like the emergence of a chronic condition rather than an acute event. Fatigue first, then joint pain, cognitive fog, the kind of physical decline that gets attributed to stress or autoimmune disorder or simply getting older. Doctors would look for explanations. Nothing obvious would surface. I would get worse. At some point during that decline, weakened, confused, perhaps desperate for relief, Curtis would suggest that selling the lake house might ease the financial pressure, that it was the practical choice, that I should sign the paperwork and let him handle it. and I, in whatever state I was in by then, might finally say yes. In his desk drawer, investigators had found the document, a property transfer form for the Center Hill Lake House in DeKalb County, already filled out. My name on the transferor line. Curtis's name on the recipient line. The property value field left blank, presumably to be completed once a buyer was arranged. The signature lines empty, waiting. It was a document built around the assumption that I would eventually be in no condition to refuse. Callahan set a second photograph on the table. A screenshot of a search history, dates running from February through August of this year. Heavy metal absorption rates, dermal uptake of thallium compounds, symptom progression timelines. The kind of search history that tells you exactly what a person was studying and why. I looked at all of it. I looked at it the way you look at something that confirms what you already knew, and still manages to be worse than you expected. And then something else surfaced, a specific memory arriving with the particular sharpness of things you hadn't known you were carrying. January, a Friday evening. Curtis had texted me in the afternoon to say he had a meeting with a potential business contact, something he said periodically, a phrase that had stopped meaning anything specific to me, and that he'd be home late. I had made soup, a simple thing, nothing elaborate, just something warm for a cold evening, the kind of meal that doesn't require much thought, but fills the apartment with a good smell. I had eaten alone at the table, watched something on television that I couldn't now tell you the name of, and fallen asleep on the couch, waiting. He had come home after midnight. I had woken up with a stiff neck and gone to bed without asking where he'd been. That was the same night as the photograph on Callahan's desk. "Are you all right?" Callahan asked. I realized I had been quiet for longer than I'd intended. "Yes," I said. "I'm fine." It wasn't entirely true, but it was true enough for the room I was sitting in. What I was feeling wasn't the collapse I might have expected, no surge of grief, no sudden unraveling. What I felt was closer to a settlement, the specific kind of stillness that arrives when you stop waiting for information and finally have all of it. When the shape of a thing becomes complete and you can see it whole for the first time. I had made soup that night. He had been with her building a plan. I had fallen asleep on the couch. "We'll be taking them both into custody tomorrow morning," Callahan said. His voice was even professional, the same measured tone he had used since the first day I sat across from him. I nodded. The thing that went quiet in me at that moment wasn't love. Love had been gone for a long time. Dissolved gradually, the way things dissolve when they are left too long in something that wasn't meant to hold them. What went quiet was something smaller and more stubborn than love. The last remaining part of me that had been holding on to the possibility that I had misread everything, that I was wrong about all of it. That part let go. The numbers on my screen had stopped making sense sometime around 8:15. I had been at my desk since 7:50 earlier than usual because the apartment had felt too still that morning, and I had needed somewhere to be that had other people in it. The office was only half full at that hour. Sandra at her desk across the room, 2 colleagues in the glass-walled conference room with coffee and an open laptop. The usual ambient hum of a Thursday morning building toward its working day. I had opened the quarterly file I was supposed to be reconciling and stared at it. I had moved the cursor. I had done nothing useful. Marlene called at 9:15. I almost didn't answer her name on my screen. At that hour was unusual enough to give me a half second of hesitation. But I picked up on the third ring and stepped back from my desk toward the window. Her voice was lower than normal, the particular register people use when they're reporting something they've witnessed and are still processing. She said 2 men had come into the building about 20 minutes ago. Plain clothes, she said, but she could tell. They had gone straight upstairs without stopping at the intercom. She had heard voices in the second-floor hallway not long, maybe 10 minutes, and then the sound of the stairwell door. She asked if I was all right. I told her I was. I thanked her. I said she should call me if she needed anything, and I ended the call. I stood at the window for a moment with the phone in my hand, looking out at Midtown, the parking structure across the street, the pale December sky sitting low over the roofline. A woman on the sidewalk below walking fast with her coat pulled across her front against the cold. Ordinary Thursday morning. The city doing what it always did. Sandra's voice came from across the room, quiet and even. "You okay?" I turned around. She was looking at me from her desk with the expression I had come to know well over the past year, attentive without being intrusive, offering without requiring. "I will be," I said. She held my gaze for a moment, then nodded once and looked back at her screen. I returned to my desk. I did not look at the quarterly file again. The text from Callahan came at 9:47. 4 words done, both of them. I read it twice. I set the phone face up on the desk beside my keyboard, deliberately face up, because I was done placing things face down and sat with those 4 words for a minute. Done. Both of them. Callahan mentioned they would likely be looking at plea negotiations within the month. I didn't care about the process. I just needed it to end. Curtis at the Germantown apartment. Tara at her place in East Nashville. Simultaneously, Callahan had told me the previous evening so that neither one could alert the other. It had gone the way these things go when they are planned carefully by people who do this for a living. I filed the quarterly reconciliation at 2:17 in the afternoon, which was about 4 hours later than it should have been, but was the best I could do. Then I gathered my bag, told Sandra I had an errand, and drove to the office of the attorney I had called the previous week. I filed the divorce papers at 3:40. The attorney's paralegal handed me a copy of everything paper-clipped in a neat stack, and I put it in my bag alongside the receipt from the lab that was still behind my library card. 2 documents, one that had started all of this and one that was closing a different chapter of it. I drove back to Germantown after. I parked in the lot behind the building and sat in the car for a while looking at the back entrance. The building looked exactly as it always had, brick a little worn at the corners, the number above the door in the same slightly crooked position it had been in since I moved in. I had come and gone through that entrance hundreds of times without thinking about it. Tonight I sat in the car for 6 minutes before I got out. I took the stairs. I stood in front of the apartment door with my key in my hand for almost 2 full minutes. Then I unlocked it and went in. The apartment was quiet in a way it had never quite been before. Not the quiet of someone sleeping in another room or the quiet of a Saturday morning before anyone was up. A different kind, the quiet of a space that has been vacated where the objects left behind are only objects now no longer organized around a person's presence. His laptop was on the desk and the office closed. A coffee mug sat on the kitchen counter, still holding an inch of dark liquid from that morning. The couch cushion on the left side was slightly compressed from use. Small evidence of a life that had existed here as recently as this morning and was now in the practical and legal sense in the process of ending. I walked through the rooms slowly. I didn't touch anything. I just looked. The bedroom was the same. The bathroom was the same. The kitchen smelled faintly of the coffee he had made before 2 men in plain clothes came up the stairs, and the morning stopped being an ordinary morning. I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets. The apartment had never been this quiet. I didn't know what to call what I was feeling. It wasn't relief. Relief implied that something painful had ended, and I wasn't sure yet what had ended and what had only changed shape. It wasn't grief either, or not exactly. It was something that lived between the two, something for which I didn't have a precise word. A feeling that required sitting on a kitchen floor in December with the overhead light off and the city sounds coming faintly through the window. I sat there for a while, and then I thought about Lorraine. I didn't know who she was or what she knew or why she had walked into a jewelry shop on Charlotte Pike on a Thursday afternoon and understood from 30 seconds with an earring in her hand what had taken me 10 sleepless nights to figure out. I didn't know what had made her act on it, or how she had reached Bernard, or what she had known about me before any of this began. But she had been there. She had seen it. And she had done something with what she saw. That meant she knew something about my life that I needed to understand. I needed to find her. Roberta answered on the second ring. I had her number saved from years back, one of those contacts you keep without thinking about it. The kind that sits quietly in your phone through apartment moves and phone upgrades and the various reorganizations of a life. I hadn't called her since the weeks after Agatha's funeral when there had been practical things to handle, and she'd been the person on the ground who knew where everything was. She didn't seem surprised to hear from me. She asked how I was doing in the straightforward way she always had, and I said I was getting through it, which was accurate enough. Then I asked if she knew a woman named Lorraine, a former jeweler possibly connected to Agatha somehow, a woman in her late 70s living south of Nashville. There was a brief pause. "Brentwood," Roberta said. "She lives in Brentwood. Hold on." She gave me a number and an address on a street called Winding Creek Lane. She said Lorraine had been Agatha's friend for a long time, longer than Roberta had known either of them. She said it in a way that suggested there was more to say, but that it wasn't hers to say it. I wrote the address down. I thanked her. I hung up and sat with the piece of paper for a moment. Then I got in the car. Brentwood was about 20 minutes south of Nashville, the kind of suburb that had expanded steadily over the decades until it had its own distinct character, quieter than the city, more settled. The streets lined with older trees that had grown wide enough to arch over the road in summer. In January, those trees were bare their branches, casting thin shadows across the pavement in the afternoon light. Winding Creek Lane was a residential street of modest houses, set back from the road behind small front yards. Number 41 had a low fence and a garden that even in January held the skeletal shapes of something that had been well tended in its season. Along the front path and the narrow beds on either side, the gray-brown stems of lavender plants stood in even rows, dried and dormant but still shaped, still holding the outline of what they would become again in spring. I stood at the gate for a moment before I went through. Lorraine answered the door before I had finished knocking. She was smaller than I had expected, fine-boned, silver-haired, with the careful posture of someone who had lived most of her life on her feet. She wore a dark cardigan over a cotton blouse and looked at me with eyes that were calm and direct, and I thought a little relieved. "Olivia," she said. Not surprised, just certain. "Yes," I said. "I hope it's all right that I came. I've been wondering when you would," she said, and opened the door wider. The inside of the house was warm and simply arranged a sitting room with 2 chairs near the window, a small bookcase, a side table with a lamp that cast a soft amber light, and on the wall beside the bookcase a collection of framed photographs, black and white, most of them the kind that age into a particular silver-gray tone, faces from earlier decades. A woman in a garden, 2 men in front of what looked like a workshop entrance, and one photograph near the center of the wall, 2 young women standing close together, laughing at something outside the frame. One of them I didn't recognize. The other I had seen in a photograph on my mother's mantle my entire childhood. Agatha. Decades younger, her hair dark, her head tilted back in a laugh I recognized even across 40 years and a change of medium. I stood in front of that photograph for a long moment. 1983, Lorraine said from behind me. A trade show in Memphis. We had known each other about 2 years by then. I turned around. She had settled into one of the chairs by the window and was watching me with the patient expression of someone who has been waiting to have a conversation and is in no hurry now that it has arrived. I sat in the other chair. She told me about Bernard first. He had been a close friend of her late husband, a quiet, observant man who had spent most of his adult life noticing things other people moved past too quickly to see. He lived in the Sylvan Park neighborhood not far from Charlotte Pike. When she had called him and explained what she needed, he had asked only 2 questions, where and when. "I couldn't call you myself," Lorraine said. "Think about what that would have sounded like. A stranger on the phone telling you your husband means to harm you. You would have assumed I was confused or worse. But a person you helped across a street, a stranger with nothing to gain saying one careful thing that you might remember." She was right. I had remembered. She told me about the earrings, how she had been visiting Gerald that Thursday afternoon, had seen the piece on his workbench, had asked about the commission out of what began as professional habit and became something else the moment Gerald explained the mechanism. 40 years of working with metal had given her an immediate and unambiguous understanding of what a heat-activated hollow post was designed to do. She had stood at that workbench and known without needing Gerald to finish his sentence exactly what she was looking at. And then Gerald had mentioned the details. A wife who was an accountant, a house on Center Hill Lake, a husband who was hoping to sell it. "I had heard about you," Lorraine said quietly. "Agatha talked about you. Her Olivia." The one who loved the lake house and wouldn't be talked out of anything once she'd made up her mind. I felt something move in my chest that I didn't try to name. She told me the rest slowly in the measured way of someone who has carried a story for a long time and knows how to set it down carefully. 40 years ago, her first husband had done something similar, not identical, but built from the same blueprint. A plan that required her to be diminished first, then persuaded, then relieved of what was hers. It had nearly worked. What had stopped it, she said, was a woman who had noticed something the rest of the room had missed and had not stayed quiet about it. Agatha, I said. Agatha, she confirmed. In the final months of Agatha's life during the calls, they had exchanged the last visit Lorraine had made to Center Hill Lake. Agatha had asked her for one thing, not a favor, exactly, more like a passing of something between them. She said, Lorraine, if my Olivia ever finds herself in real trouble, please don't let her face it alone. Those were her words. I told her I wouldn't. The room was very quiet. I stood up. I didn't plan it. My body moved before the thought was fully formed. I crossed the small distance between the two chairs and put my arms around her, and she held on with the steady, unhurried grip of someone who had been waiting to do exactly this. And I cried. I cried for the glass of warm water on a bathroom shelf and the 10 nights I had lain awake beside someone building a plan against me. I cried for the unsigned document in a desk drawer and the soup I had made on a January evening and eaten alone. I cried for the woman in the photograph on the wall laughing at something outside the frame 40 years ago, who had loved me carefully enough that her protection had reached me long after she was gone. The Davidson County Courthouse smelled like recycled air and old paper, the particular institutional scent of a building that processes serious things with administrative regularity. I had arrived 20 minutes early. Lorraine and Roberta were already in the hallway outside the courtroom when I got there. Lorraine in a dark wool coat, Roberta in the navy jacket she had worn to Agatha's funeral 3 years ago. Both of them standing near the window at the end of the corridor in the quiet, unhurried way of people who have shown up somewhere because they decided to and have no reservations about the decision. Lorraine squeezed my hand when she saw me. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. We went in and took seats in the third row on the gallery side. Lorraine on my right, Roberta on my left. The room was larger than I had expected, high-ceiling wood paneling along the front wall, the kind of proportions designed to communicate that what happens here is of consequence. The public gallery was maybe half full. Attorneys at the tables up front, a court reporter with her machine, the low procedural murmur of a room preparing for something to begin. I'd been in this building once before, briefly to sign documents related to the divorce. That had been a different floor, a different room, a different kind of finality. This was the last one. Curtis came in through a side door at 9:03. He was in a gray suit that I didn't recognize, not something from our apartment, something he or his attorney had arranged. He looked smaller than he had the last time I had seen him, which was the morning I opened the bathroom door, and he was standing in the hallway with a coffee mug. His shoulders were slightly forward, his eyes on the middle distance ahead of him. He sat down without looking at the gallery. He did not look in my direction. Not once during the entire time he was in that room. Tara came in 2 minutes later through the same door. She was younger looking in person than in the photograph Callahan had placed on his desk in November, or perhaps it was the context that made her seem younger. The particular vulnerability of someone being led into a room where a decision about the next several years of their life will be announced to them in formal language by a stranger behind an elevated desk. She was composed in the deliberate way of someone working hard to stay that way. Her eyes moved across the gallery once briefly before she sat down. I watched her face during that survey of the room. It passed over me and kept moving. Then something I don't know what, some small recognition made her glance back. She looked at me for perhaps 3 seconds. Her expression shifted in a way that was hard to name precisely, not quite surprise, not quite calculation. Something closer to the expression of a person trying to understand how a variable they had accounted for had nevertheless not behaved as predicted. I looked back at her without changing my expression. Then I looked forward. Neither of them had chosen to go to trial, Both had entered guilty pleas in late February, waiving their right to a jury. The hearing that morning was only for sentencing. The judge entered at 9:15. The room stood and sat in the practiced collective motion of a proceeding. The judge settled at the bench, reviewed the materials in front of her, and began. The formal language of a sentencing hearing moves in a particular rhythm, procedural, deliberate, each element placed in its required order. I had read about the charges had spoken, with the attorney had known for weeks what the likely range would be given the guilty pleas. Knowing did not make the hearing shorter or the language less heavy. The judge read the nature of the offenses. She referenced the toxicology findings, the documented planning across 10 months, the evidence of deliberate and sustained intent. She spoke about the victim, and when she said that word, she followed it with my name, Olivia. In the context of a legal proceeding, your name sounds different than it does anywhere else. Stripped of informality placed in the official record of something that actually happened, read aloud in a room built for consequence. I heard it land in that space and felt something shift inside me, something that had been pressed flat for a very long time, something heavy and without a clean name, releasing from somewhere between my ribs. Curtis 15 years, Tara 8 years. The judge continued speaking something about conditions of sentencing and the formal record, but the specific words moved past me. I sat with those two numbers and let them be what they were. Lorraine's hand found mine on the bench between us. She held it the way she had held it in her sitting room in January, steady and unhurried. The grip of someone who has been through enough to know what a person needs at a given moment and provides exactly that. Roberta on my left sat very still with her hands folded in her lap, looking straight ahead. There was something in her posture that reminded me of Agatha, the particular uprightness of a woman who has seen a great deal and has decided, having seen it, to remain upright. Near the end of the proceedings, Tara turned in her seat and looked at me again. Longer this time. The composed expression had slipped slightly, and what was underneath it was harder to read, something between incomprehension and the beginning of a realization she was not finished having. I held her gaze for a moment. Then I looked away because I had nothing to say to her with my eyes or otherwise, and because the room was finishing its work, and I wanted to be present for the end of it. Curtis never turned around. When it was over, the three of us walked out together through the main doors and into the April morning. The sun was the particular quality of Nashville in early spring warm, without being insistent, the air still carrying a trace of the morning's coolness underneath it. The street outside the courthouse was going about its ordinary business, indifferent to what had just concluded inside. Lorraine held my hand as we came down the steps. I stopped on the bottom step and stood there for a moment, looking out at the street at the ordinary Tuesday morning, at the light coming through the new leaves on the trees along the median. For the first time since September, I remembered what it felt like to breathe without calculating anything first. The drive from Nashville to Center Hill Lake takes about an hour and 15 minutes on a clear morning, following I-40 east until the city dissolves behind you, and Tennessee becomes itself exits, growing farther apart, tree lines thickening on both sides of the road. The ridgelines of the Cumberland Plateau rising in the distance, with the unhurried permanence of things that were here long before the highway and will remain long after it. I had made this drive many times, as a child pressed against the back window watching for the first glimpse of water, as an adult usually with someone else in the passenger seat or a list of tasks waiting at the other end. This was the first time I had made it alone, and with nothing I needed to accomplish once I arrived, no agenda, no conversation to manage, no version of myself I was required to present. Somewhere around the 40-minute mark, when the interstate had settled into a long, open stretch between exits, I noticed that I had not reached for the radio. Not once. I had not rehearsed a thought or filled the quiet with anything at all. I had simply driven, and the silence had been something I was moving through rather than something I was enduring. My therapist had said back in February that one of the markers of recovery is when stillness stops feeling like a threat. I had written it down and not been sure I understood it. On that stretch of I-40 with the morning light coming through the windshield at a low, warm angle, I thought I was beginning to. The gate key was on the same ring as my apartment key, a habit of continuity I had maintained without thinking about it across 2 years, a marriage that had ended, and 3 seasons without using it. The lock turned without resistance. Roberta had been keeping up with it the way she had kept up with everything else. I pushed the gate open and drove the gravel path down to the house. The yard had grown long in my absence, knee-high grass along the fence line, a volunteer vine working its way over the corner of the porch railing, the raised beds thick with weeds that had taken full advantage of the untended soil. One shutter on the east window had lost a hinge and leaned slightly against the siding. The woodwork on the porch needed sanding. The whole property had the look of a place that had been waiting patiently for someone to come back and mean it. Beyond all of it, the lake was the same. Still in silver in the May morning light, the far bank lined with cedar and pine, the surface moving in that slow and rhythmic way, the world breathing, before it decided what kind of day to become. I stood at the edge of the porch and looked at it for a long time without going inside. I let it be what it had always been. I let myself be someone who was allowed to stand here. Inside, the rooms were dusty but intact. Roberta had kept the windows sealed and managed the practical things, leaving everything else largely as it had been a form of respect, I thought, for whatever decision I would eventually make about the space. The cast iron wood stove was cold but clean. The cedar closet still held their scent, the particular combination of wood and age, and something faintly sweet that I had never found anywhere else. On the kitchen windowsill, where Agatha had always kept a small clay pot, there was a single dried stem of something I couldn't identify, the last remnant of whatever she had grown in her final spring. I left it where it was. I opened every window in the house. Then I got the broom from the back closet and started at the front room, working inward. I washed the surfaces with warm water. I swept the floors twice. I worked without a schedule, without urgency, room by room, and somewhere in the middle of the back bedroom, I understood what my therapist had meant about reclaiming space. It was not about making a place clean. It was about moving through it on your own terms, one room at a time, until it begins to feel like yours again. I was finishing the kitchen when the screen door opened. Roberta came in without ceremony, carrying a foil-wrapped pan of cornbread in one hand and a paper bag of early tomatoes from her garden in the other. She set them both on the counter, looked around at the open windows and the clean surfaces, and made a sound of quiet approval. "Looks like yourself in here again," she said. We ate lunch on the porch, watching a pair of herons work the shallow end of the cove below the property line. Roberta told me she'd been checking the house every 2 weeks since October. She said it without expectation of acknowledgement. It was simply what she had done because it was what needed doing. That was Roberta. That had always been Roberta. Lorraine arrived Sunday morning, her daughter driving the 60 miles from Brentwood, in a practical arrangement that Lorraine had agreed to, with her usual quiet pragmatism. They stayed through the afternoon. The 4 of us sat on the porch, Lorraine and her daughter in the 2 rocking chairs, Roberta and I on the steps with tea, and what remained of the cornbread. The conversation moved the way conversation does between people who are not performing for one another, drifting from one subject to another without agenda, pausing when it needed to and resuming without the awkwardness that requires filling. At some point in the middle of the afternoon, Lorraine set her cup down and said that Agatha had told her once that Center Hill Lake was the place where she felt most like herself. Not the version of herself she showed the world, Lorraine said, looking out at the water. The one underneath, the one that didn't need to explain anything to anyone. I thought about that. About the woman who had taught me to stand at a window with a cup of coffee and simply look at what was in front of me. About flowers that fought to stay. About the particular steadiness of a person who has been through enough to know what matters and has stopped being uncertain about it. I think I'm starting to understand what she meant, I said. Lorraine looked at me and smiled the small, unhurried smile of someone who recognizes something returning to its right place. Before they left, I carried the seedlings I had brought from a nursery in East Nashville down to the front path and began pressing them into the soil in 2 even rows, 12 lavender plants, the same stubborn variety that had grown in Agatha's garden at this house for as long as I could remember. The ground was soft from the rain 2 days earlier, the soil dark and yielding in the way that good Tennessee earth is in May. Roberta stood at the gate and watched without offering to help. She understood, I think, that some work belongs to specific hands and is diminished by assistance. I planted all 12, tamped the soil around each one, and stood at the end of the path and looked at the 2 uneven rows of small gray-green plants leading to the front door. They would take a season to establish. The first year, they would look uncertain of themselves. By the second year, they would be committed. By the third, they would be the kind of thing that comes back regardless. Sunday morning, before I locked the house and started back toward Nashville, I drove into Smithville and found the small woodworking shop on Main Street that Roberta had mentioned, a family operation 30 years in the same location, the kind of place that builds things meant to outlast the occasion. The man at the counter had sawdust on his forearms and the ease of someone who has spent most of his working life making things by hand. He asked what I wanted on it, the size, the wood, the lettering. I told him without hesitating. The drive from Nashville to Center Hill Lake takes about an hour and 15 minutes on a clear morning, following I-40 east until the city dissolves behind you, and Tennessee becomes itself exits growing farther apart, tree lines thickening on both sides of the road, the ridge lines of the Cumberland Plateau rising in the distance with the unhurried permanence of things that were here long before the highway and will remain long after it. I had made this drive many times, as a child pressed against the back window, watching for the first glimpse of water. As an adult, usually with someone else in the passenger seat or a list of tasks waiting at the other end. This was the first time I had made it alone and with nothing I needed to accomplish once I arrived, no agenda, no conversation to manage, no version of myself I was required to present. Somewhere around the 40-minute mark, when the interstate had settled into a long open stretch between exits, I noticed that I had not reached for the radio. Not once. I had not rehearsed a thought or filled the quiet with anything at all. I had simply driven, and the silence had been something I was moving through rather than something I was enduring. My therapist had said back in February that one of the markers of recovery is when stillness stops feeling like a threat. I'd written it down and not been sure I understood it. On that stretch of I-40 with the morning light coming through the windshield at a low, warm angle, I thought I was beginning to. The gate key was on the same ring as my apartment key, a habit of continuity I had maintained without thinking about it across 2 years, a marriage that had ended, and 3 seasons without using it. The lock turned without resistance. Roberta had been keeping up with it the way she had kept up with everything else. I pushed the gate open and drove the gravel path down to the house. The yard had grown long in my absence. Knee-high grass along the fence line, a volunteer vine working its way over the corner of the porch railing, the raised beds thick with weeds that had taken full advantage of the untended soil. One shutter on the east window had lost a hinge and leaned slightly against the siding. The woodwork on the porch needed sanding. The whole property had the look of a place that had been waiting patiently for someone to come back and mean it. Beyond all of it, the lake was the same, still and silver in the May morning light, the far bank lined with cedar and pine. The surface moving in that slow and rhythmic way, the world breathing before it decided what kind of day to become. I stood at the edge of the porch and looked at it for a long time without going inside. I let it be what it had always been. I let myself be someone who was allowed to stand here. Inside, the rooms were dusty but intact. Roberta had kept the windows sealed and managed the practical things, leaving everything else largely as it had been a form of respect, I thought, for whatever decision I would eventually make about the space. The cast iron wood stove was cold but clean. The cedar closets still held their scent, the particular combination of wood and age, and something faintly sweet that I had never found anywhere else. On the kitchen windowsill, where Agatha had always kept a small clay pot, there was a single dried stem of something I couldn't identify, the last remnant of whatever she had grown in her final spring. I left it where it was. I opened every window in the house. Then I got the broom from the back closet and started at the front room, working inward. I washed the surfaces with warm water. I swept the floors twice. I worked without a schedule, without urgency, room by room, and somewhere in the middle of the back bedroom, I understood what my therapist had meant about reclaiming space. It was not about making a place clean. It was about moving through it on your own terms, one room at a time, until it begins to feel like yours again. I was finishing the kitchen when the screen door opened. Roberta came in without ceremony, carrying a foil-wrapped pan of cornbread in one hand and a paper bag of early tomatoes from her garden in the other. She set them both on the counter, looked around at the open windows and the clean surfaces, and made a sound of quiet approval. "Looks like yourself in here again," she said. We ate lunch on the porch, watching a pair of herons work the shallow end of the cove below the property line. Roberta told me she'd been checking the house every 2 weeks since October. She said it without expectation of acknowledgement. It was simply what she had done because it was what needed doing. That was Roberta. That had always been Roberta. Lorraine arrived Sunday morning, her daughter, driving the 60 miles from Brentwood in a practical arrangement that Lorraine had agreed to with her usual quiet pragmatism. They stayed through the afternoon. The four of us sat on the porch, Lorraine and her daughter, in the 2 rocking chairs, Roberta and I on the steps with tea and what remained of the cornbread. The conversation moved the way conversation does between people who are not performing for one another, drifting from one subject to another without agenda, pausing when it needed to and resuming without the awkwardness that requires filling. At some point in the middle of the afternoon, Lorraine set her cup down and said that Agatha had told her once that Center Hill Lake was the place where she felt most like herself. Not the version of herself she showed the world, Lorraine said, looking out at the water, the one underneath, the one that didn't need to explain anything to anyone. I thought about that. About the woman who had taught me to stand at a window with a cup of coffee and simply look at what was in front of me. About flowers that fought to stay. About the particular steadiness of a person who has been through enough to know what matters and has stopped being uncertain about it. "I think I'm starting to understand what she meant," I said. Lorraine looked at me and smiled the small, unhurried smile of someone who recognizes something returning to its right place. Before they left, I carried the seedlings I had brought from a nursery in East Nashville down to the front path and began pressing them into the soil in 2 even rows, 12 lavender plants, the same stubborn variety that had grown in Agatha's garden at this house for as long as I could remember. The ground was soft from the rain 2 days earlier, the soil dark and yielding in the way that good Tennessee earth is in May. Roberta stood at the gate and watched without offering to help. She understood, I think, that some work belongs to specific hands and is diminished by assistance. I planted all 12, tamped the soil around each one, and stood at the end of the path and looked at the 2 uneven rows of small gray-green plants leading to the front door. They would take a season to establish. The first year, they would look uncertain of themselves. By the second year, they would be committed. By the third, they would be the kind of thing that comes back regardless. Sunday morning, before I locked the house and started back toward Nashville, I drove into Smithville and found the small woodworking shop on Main Street that Roberta had mentioned, a family operation 30 years in the same location. The kind of place that builds things meant to outlast the occasion. The man at the counter had sawdust on his forearms and the ease of someone who has spent most of his working life making things by hand. He asked what I wanted on it, the size, the wood, the lettering. I told him without hesitating, Task 18. The sign arrived on a Friday morning, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, delivered by a man from the woodworking shop in Smithville, who set it carefully against the porch railing and left without ceremony. I unwrapped it alone. The oak was pale gold, the grain running in long, even lines across the face of the board. The letters had been cut deep, not painted on, not stenciled, but carved into the wood itself so that they would hold their shape through weather and seasons and years. I ran my fingers across the carved grooves the way you read something in a language older than words. Agatha's place. I stood there on the porch of Center Hill Lake for a long moment, holding the sign with both hands, not quite ready to move. There are things that take the full length of an experience to understand. You can know a fact at the beginning and not understand it until the end. And the distance between those 2 points is where everything that matters actually happens. I had known since the morning I stood at a bathroom window, holding a glass of discolored water, that something had been done to me deliberately. I had known since the afternoon I sat across from Callahan with a manila envelope in my hands what that something was and who had done it. I had known since the evening in Lorraine's sitting room in Brentwood where the thread had begun and how long it had been running. But standing at this gate with this sign, I understood something I hadn't been able to reach before. I thought about Bernard at the crosswalk on Charlotte Pike, the gray velvet jacket, the unhurried voice, the way he had stopped in the middle of an intersection and asked me a single question. I thought about the glass of warm water sitting on a bathroom shelf through a long, careful night. I thought about the manila envelope and the sentence I read 3 times intentionally designed. I thought about Lorraine in a jewelry shop on a Thursday afternoon, holding an earring in her hand and understanding in 30 seconds what she was looking at, and then choosing without hesitation, without any obligation to act on what she knew. I thought about Agatha standing at a kitchen window 40 years ago with a cup of strong coffee watching the light come across the water. Every single one of those things had led here, to this gate, to this sign. To this ordinary Friday morning in May with the lake behind me and the lavender seedlings in the ground and my hands steady. I picked up the hammer. The sound of the first strike rang out across the water and came back changed, softened by distance rounded at the edges. The way sound returns to you differently after it has traveled over open water. I drove the first bracket into the post with 4 strikes, then the second. I lifted the sign and set it into the brackets and stepped back to look. The morning light was coming through the trees at a low angle the way May light does before the sun clears the upper branches, filtering and warm moving slightly as the leaves moved, falling across the carved letters in a way that made them read clearly even from a distance. Agatha's place. I pressed my palm flat against the wood against the letters of her name and held it there. Agatha used to say not often, but on particular occasions. Usually evenings when the lake was still and the conversation had drifted into the kind of territory that only opens up in that quality of quiet, that God had a way of sending help that didn't look like help until afterward, that the person who showed up exactly when you needed them rarely arrived with any announcement of their purpose. That's how you know, she would say. Angels don't come with fanfare. They come with sore knees and a bus schedule. I had thought she was being poetic. I understand now that she was being precise. Lorraine had sore knees. Bernard had a bus schedule and a gray jacket worn thin at the cuffs. Roberta had a wind chime and a standing offer of cornbread. None of them had appeared in a moment of obvious drama. They had been present and paying attention and willing, and in being all 3 of those things at the right time, they had changed the course of something. I had spent most of my adult life believing that I needed to be self-sufficient. That asking for help was a form of weakness that, depending on anyone, was a risk that outcomes had confirmed I was right to avoid. I had carried that belief through a marriage that quietly used it against me, that relied on my willingness to absorb and manage and not ask too many questions. What I know now, standing at this gate, is that self-sufficiency is not the same as being alone, that there is a difference between carrying your own weight and refusing every hand that reaches toward you, that the people who loved Agatha had loved me through her and kept on loving me after she was gone, not because I asked them to, but because that is what love does when it is the real kind. It makes arrangements. It keeps its word. It finds a way. I believe God had something to do with that. I can't tell you exactly how, and I won't try to. But I know that the chain of events that led from a Thursday afternoon in a jewelry shop to a Wednesday crosswalk to a bathroom shelf to a sentencing hearing to this gate in May did not happen by accident. Something was moving through all of it. Something was keeping track. I stepped back from the Colt post and looked at the sign one more time. The carved letters caught the light. The lavender rows along the path were still small, still finding their footing in the Tennessee soil, but they were there, committed as lavender tends to be once it has made up its mind. I thought about Agatha, about the version of herself she had brought to this place, the one underneath the public-facing version, the one that didn't need to explain anything to anyone. I thought about the dried stem still on the kitchen windowsill, the last one from her final spring. I had left it there on purpose. This place had waited for me. I had come back. If any part of this story found its way into something you've been carrying, if you recognized yourself in the glass of warm water, in the 10 days of pretending, Or in the moment of standing at a gate you weren't sure you'd ever reach, I'd like to know. Who is your Lorraine, who showed up for you when you didn't even know to ask, leave a comment? Tell me. And if you know someone who needs to hear that they are not as alone as they believe, share this with them. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because the thing Agatha knew and Lorraine knew and Bernard in his gray velvet jacket knew is this: none of us gets through the hard parts entirely on our own. We were never meant to. I stepped back from the gate. The morning light shifted as a cloud passed and returned the letters of the sign brightening and settling again, steady in the oak. I pressed my hand once more against her name. Then I let go. I walked to the car, set my bag on the passenger seat, and started the engine. 1 hour and 15 minutes back to Nashville. The same road I had taken out here, the same ridge lines, the same long stretches between exits where the world becomes quiet and you are free to be nothing in particular. For the first time in a very long time, I was looking forward to the drive. Looking back on everything that happened, the glass of water, the 10 days of pretending, the envelope in a parking lot on Murfreesboro Pike. I keep returning to one uncomfortable truth. The most dangerous thing I did throughout all of it wasn't staying silent. It was convincing myself for far too long that silence was the same as safety, that not naming a thing meant it wasn't real, that as long as I didn't ask the question out loud, the answer couldn't hurt me. It could. It did. And I lost time I won't get back. So if this family story found you at a moment when something in your own life feels slightly off a gift that doesn't sit right, a kindness that lands like performance, a question you keep folding smaller because you're not ready for the answer, please don't do what I did. Don't wait for the water to turn. Don't wait until the evidence is undeniable before you allow yourself to trust what you already feel. Your instincts are not paranoia. They are information. Treat them that way. This is at its heart a family story about what remains when everything false has finally been cleared away. And what I found underneath, when the pretending stopped and the truth came out and the people who loved me showed themselves, was something I had not let myself expect. I was never as alone as I believed. Agatha had made quiet arrangements long before I knew I would need them. Lorraine had kept a promise across 40 years without ever being asked to renew it. Roberta had checked the house every 2 weeks without telling me. Bernard had walked to a crosswalk on a Wednesday afternoon and said my name. I believe God had something to do with that. Not in a loud or obvious way, but in the way certain things arrive exactly when they need to, through people who simply chose to show up. That is the kind of presence I have learned to stop dismissing as coincidence. And her revenge, if you want to call it that, looked nothing like I once imagined. There was no dramatic confrontation, no moment of standing over someone's ruin with satisfaction. Her revenge was a toxicology report placed on a detective's desk. It was a divorce filing on a Thursday afternoon. It was 12 lavender plants pressed into Tennessee soil and a carved oak sign hung at the gate of a house someone tried to take from me. That is the only her revenge I would ever want, the kind that gives you your life back rather than consuming what remains of it. If this family story reached something real in you, I want to hear about it. Leave a comment, tell me what you would have done differently in Olivia's place, or share who your Lorraine is. I read every single one. And if stories told this way are what you come here for, subscribing means you'll be here for the next one. One final note: this story draws on deeply human themes, but includes dramatized elements for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real people or places is coincidental. The message, however, is one I hope you carry with you.
Alright, that's it for this one. I appreciate you watching. I'll see you next time.